Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. My name is Daniel Dietrich. So glad to be with you. It's Wednesday, so it is Faith Day. We've got our panel of pastors ready to discuss things of faith and the common good. And today I'm joined by Laura Truax and Dominique Gilliard and our guest, David Swanson. We'll introduce him in just a minute. A couple housekeeping notes. This podcast is on pause for the next 2 weeks because I'll be down at the southern border on the We the People ride. I will be on a bicycle, pedaling my best. It's not necessarily my thing, but I'm joining the Vote Common Good crew that's down there on the southern border right now. We're trying to raise awareness around immigration and border policy reform, and we're going to be listening and telling stories down there. So that's where I'll be the next 2 weeks, and since I'm the producer of this show and the internet isn't great down there, we're taking 2 weeks off from this show. But I'm excited about today's conversation, and I'll pitch it over to Dominique, and we'll go from there.
Good morning, everybody. Excited to be with you today and have my friend David Swanson with us. Celebrating today as the first day of Hispanic Heritage Month, or what I am moving towards opting for is Latin, informed by the new book Abuelita Faith, and really trying to wrestle with some of the gender dynamics of using Latino, Latina, or the way Latinx has not been wholesalely embraced by our Latin sisters and brothers, and so trying to figure out what the best linguistic option is to faithfully affirm the holistic encompassing of the Latin community. So excited to continue to have these conversations together and get into the muck and the mire as we try to discern what faithfulness looks like. And I'll kick it over to you, Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. Dominique's down in Atlanta. I am here in Chicago and loving it as we turn toward cooler weather. It's been good. We are missing a couple of our regulars here. Stephanie Spalding is out today. And of course, Doug Padgett is along the southern border, as Dan referenced. And last time I checked, they were around Yuma, Arizona. Is that?
Yeah,
so they'll be in Arizona for a minute. Yeah,
started in Yuma today. So
yeah, but we are really excited to have David Swanson on the show today. David is a pastor friend. He wrote a wonderful book about his own experiences in pastoring and the way he approaches life and ministry in community with others. It's called Rediscipling the White Church: From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity. And it's been a wonderful read. It came out last year, I want to say May, David, 2020. I still see a lot of stuff about it. It's just one of those books that's got some legs on it, and people are being blessed by it and using it as a resource for how they rethink and redisciple themselves and their communities. So thank you. A couple of big headlining questions, David, as we turn it to you. And first, we want you to just introduce yourself. But when you do that, will you talk a little bit about who you are and your legacy, where you come from, your people, your background a little bit, and where you're at right now in Chicago. So we turn to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, thanks, Laura. And Dan and Dominique, it's good to be with you all this morning. And also, Laura, with you, am thankful for the cooler weather as of today. I think we're back into the high 80s later this week, though. So
yeah,
kind of classic Chicago fall. Yeah, exactly. I am here in Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. For those who don't know, Bronzeville is a historic African-American community here on the south side of Chicago. Historically was really the neighborhood where Black people could move with some degree of safety as they kind of left or escaped Jim Crow violence in the South during the era of reconstruction and so-called redemption. And so it's a neighborhood that has a very significant legacy in our city. And it's been pretty amazing over the past 11 years for our church to get to be a part of that and to make some really good friends in our community and to participate with them in the really good work that's been happening in this community for a very, very long time. Married to Maggie for 20-something years, 2 great boys who are back in school now here at Chicago Public Schools.
Praise God.
Yes, exactly. Right. They're doing it with the masks on, and we're really grateful for that. It's been a good few weeks for them. I grew up a missionary kid. My dad flew little airplanes around Venezuela and Ecuador for most of my childhood. So grew up in what was for me a kind of cross-cultural environment. And called to local church ministry out of graduate school, which was a surprise and not part of the plan, but really thankful for about 20 years of parish pastoral ministry. Feel very clear that that's where God has called me. Both Dominica and I are part of the Evangelical Covenant Church. I don't know how Dominique would describe our denomination. Not a lot of folks know it. We have a history coming out of Swedish immigrants who had sort of a mission emphasis towards other immigrants. And I'll let Dominique fill in any of the important theological details about our small little group of Christians. But for a church like ours, an intentionally multiracial congregation, the Covenant has been a hospitable denomination for us with its history of pietism, and then more recently multiracial, multi-ethnic ministries. So the other thing I'll just say is, being in our neighborhood and pastoring a multiracial church has given me over the past decade a sort of experience of having feet in 2 different worlds, the world of our neighborhood and our congregation, and then at times world of majority white communities and congregations, and realizing what a vast gulf there often is between these two, where we proclaim the same Lord, we read the same Bible, and yet our experiences of the world can be so radically different. And so a lot of that experience informed some of the questions that led to this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the subtitle of this book, From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity, it's such busted, right? I think most of us will read that and say, yeah, busted, the cheap diversity piece. And the rarity of true solidarity. Maybe could we start? We hear the phrase a lot of the time about spaces and white spaces, and I think some of us can think, oh, white spaces is a space with a lot of white people, but it's way more. It's way more than that, right? Yeah. So, can you kind of start by just unpacking that phrase and what's going on in that phrase?
Mm-hmm. I think the first time that I really reckoned with what you just described there, Laura, was early on in the life of our church. Our now associate pastor, a scholar named Michelle Dodson, recommended a book to me called The Elusive Dream by a scholar at Ohio State named Corey Edwards. And Dr. Edwards had done some ethnographic research of multiracial churches pastored by people of different races. And what she found was that the majority of these congregations, sort of no matter how racially or ethnically diverse they were generally monocultural. And that culture, no surprise, is white. And the reason for this, as she articulates in the book, is that white people are not accustomed to being in the minority. White people, being in the majority ourselves, have not had the experience of interacting in cross-cultural or intercultural environments. And so we tend to experience discomfort in those spaces as being something negative that pushes us or that causes us to leave those spaces. And people of color, on the other hand, are That's not their experience.
Mm-hmm.
By and large in this country, to be a person of color is to be very well versed in, kind of navigating different cultural spaces. But people of
Mm-hmm.
color are also generally aware that white people do not have these skills, and so to keep white people in the room is often to accommodate to their norms, to our norms. And so there's these kind of layers happening, and we're not always communicating about these things. And frankly, white people are generally not equipped or prepared to even have those kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about white spaces, yes, that could be demographically white, and there's plenty of those spaces in our country and in our churches. And we could talk a little bit more later about why I think even those majority white spaces are also called to this work of solidarity. But you're right that churches like mine also need to wrestle with this, that we need to acknowledge that left alone, our default will be to a kind of cultural whiteness, one in which we ask or assume that people of color are assimilating to some of our assumptions, rather than creating an environment in which people are bringing their full cultural selves to that space, and where there's kind of mutual formation that's happening. So thankfully, we have people like Dr. Michael Emerson or Dr. Glenn Bracey, Dr. Corey Edwards, folks who've really helped us in more recent years think really carefully about this and see some of the stuff that I think we maybe missed earlier on in the multiracial church movement. But it's still a lot of work, and there's still a lot of formation that needs to happen in order for us to even see and name some of these dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think about how in our church, I'm at LaSalle Street Church in Chicago, and how often we are all in on moving from cheap diversity to true solidarity. It's this is what we're all about. Our energy is focused that way. We interrogate our worship services. We examine our structures of how we get elders in our church, the whole nomination process. I mean, we do the whole 9 yards, right? And we're all there for about 6 months. And then it's easy that the ebb and the flow of church life, and I'm not making any excuses. I'm just saying that where I sit as a pastor, the ongoing kind of attention that's necessary starts to ebb. This kind of attention that you have to keep around not forgetting, and just and not forgetting also. Just remembering that I keep seeing the world as a white person, and I gotta keep remembering that that's just my lens, and it's and not forget.
Yeah.
That's hard. That's hard.
Yeah.
But people are doing it. So tell us how that kind of takes root. How this true solidarity piece can really manifest itself more strongly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. And I certainly wouldn't want to hold up our congregation as any kind of exemplar. We are as in process, I think, as any other church. But I love that dynamic that you're pointing out, and maybe a couple things to say about this. For a congregation who, is waking up to some of this stuff, or more like yours, is deeply committed to this. I do think that one of the marks of maturity here is that we acknowledge that this is never going to not be the thing. I think too many of us have assumed that multiracial ministry is like it's a thing that we do rather than who we are. And when you make that shift, you realize that this can't just be a sermon series once a year, or we do a weekend retreat or something. We're talking about our identity as the people of God, the reconciled people of God. And this takes constant attending because we realize the kind of how the principalities and powers of this world continue to threaten that identity, that we breathe an air that warps our imagination, that forms us to think of one another not as sister and brother, but as other in some kind of way. And so I've had people in our church say, now, are we ever going to talk about something something else? And the answer is no, we're not, because we're talking about our identity, and we realize how fragile that identity is, and how in many ways we're simply not good enough to hold that identity together. And so we're going to constantly be bringing this to the cross, asking the Spirit of God to breathe life into this identity. Now, the Holy Spirit bears all kinds of fruit from that identity, right? So, of course, the work of justice and mercy and compassion in this world are going to take lots of different forms and expressions. But we believe that fruit will come from the identity of this reconciled and reconciling people. The only other thing I'd say here, and actually I'm kind of curious what Dominique thinks about this line of thought, is that, as you say, Laura, for those of us who are white, there is this tension of we catch a glimpse of it, and we're living into it, and then there's something else, right?
Yeah.
And we're never woke. There's no woke white person, right? We're always struggling to wake up in some kind of way. This is not true necessarily, though, for many of our colleagues of color, for whom the vision here is just much more clear, and the kind of essential nature of this work and ministry is much more central. And so I have found in my own life how important it is to be in relationships where I'm submitted to leaders of color in our congregation and our community, who have the authority to remind me where I have, made this secondary or have lost the plot in some kind of way, and to ensure that in our systems and structures as a congregation, that those voices have the authority to call us to account and to keep this vision in front of us, so that we're not kind of constantly trying to veer back on course, which I think would probably be my tendency as a white pastor, but where we have more steady leadership who have a clearer vision, who are also helping us to lead the way. I don't know, Dominique, I am kind of curious though how you would see some of that.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say the temptation for white Christians, as much as you can name the fact that it's not a checkbox, is to think about it as a checkbox. Like that, I have done my due diligence, and we have faithfully attended to and reckoned with this. And so that reckoning, that one-time reckoning, in a substantial way, so don't hear me marginalizing it, in a substantial way, should be enough to sustain us as we get back on track and really reckon with the true goal of the gospel, which is not this. Like, I can understand that this is a part of it, but this isn't, really what we're supposed to be focused on here. So if we attend to this in depth once, that should be able to sustain us as we get back and recalibrate ourselves to what we're really supposed to be focusing on. And that's just not the perspective of people who this is an everyday occurrence. We understand the permanence of this conversation. I was debating back and forth if I should say this, just because I know how people try to distort things and take it out of context. But I'm gonna do it.
Let's go.
So for example, 9/11 is this, tragic, horrific thing that completely, fundamentally altered our experience as U.S. citizens, like across the board, from coast to coast. People were impacted, lives were lost. It it Our safety was infringed upon. But 4 days later, on today, we also remember that this is the 68th anniversary of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. And for me, we will hear never forget out the wazoo about 9/11 and won't hear that today. But this informed my life much more significantly than 9/11 did. And so for me, like, I think that's a good illustration of kind of what we're talking about, how this is something that happened to Black people from other citizens of this country in an elongated history of domestic terrorism that we refuse to reckon with, and are institutionally suppressing this conversation within our educational system. But yet this conversation about, a threat from abroad in 9/11 is something that we are overzealous to have conversations about and actually shift legislation and policy and all of these things. And I think it's just it's a beautiful illustration of kind of what you're trying to parse out, David.
Wow. Yeah.
It very much
Yeah.
matters who is shaping those conversations, right? And when if it's just me, then the thing that Dominique just described, the memory that he just described, the formational nature of that memory, that event, is all lost. Or at the very least, it's brought into the pulpit, sometime in February, or there's a moment, or there's a course correction, and then we go back, rather than this becomes woven into our understanding of what it means to be the people of God, to not forget what we have to remember in order to be formed in these kinds of ways. I love that example.
Yeah, it's one of the things that you say in your book, that we've got this discipleship problem. And it's a discipleship problem as Christians, and it's a racial discipleship as well. And you give some really great examples in there. That whole section, David, where you really break down what does it mean to be leading in this in a community of faith. I mean, so kind of talk about that a little bit. These areas where, because for instance, childcare. We have a childcare agency at our church that is little used by our Sunday congregation. It's a neighborhood-based childcare. It draws people from families from all over the near north side. And we've internally, we've articulated this as being, what does it mean to live out the fuller beloved community? We are very intentional about who comes to that childcare. We're very intentional about making sure that stays diverse. We're intentional about doing all the backroom stuff to make sure that happens. But I realized we have not been good about articulating to our congregation the way that little children are enculturated into their racial identities. We haven't been explicit, as your book points out, like be clear, use real language that is explicit language around racial identity and words like privilege and white supremacy, and just at a young age, articulating something that is connected to what people are, what families, the language families should be using, the language they should be hearing in their home, resourcing the parents, equipping them. So kind of like talk about these various ways that churches can go about leading and moving more deeply into this.
I love that you brought up our children. That was a really important chapter to me, and I'm actually gonna invite Dominique to jump in here again in a second too, because he and I have talked about this a lot over the years and some of the work that we've done, and I've certainly learned a lot from him on this. Briefly, I think that white Christians have completely missed or massively underestimated the power of what I call racial discipleship or racial formation. Sometimes white congregations will identify other things in our society or our culture, other kind of forming, influences, and we say, well, those things are orienting us away from the kingdom of God, and so we, as a people, are going to be intentional to root ourselves in Scripture and orient ourselves more deeply towards the heart of God. By and large, we have not, as white Christians, done that when it comes to race. Instead, we've embraced the racial status quo and kind of baptized it. We've, on an implicit level at least, communicated to those in our churches that the status quo is okay, that it's compatible with the ethic of the kingdom of God. Again, I'm simply talking about white Christians here, and this is a kind of abdication of our responsibility, particularly as pastors who are called to disciple and form our people. So my point in this book is that there are ways that our congregations can begin to disciple in a different direction. But part of that is going to have to involve naming that status quo, naming that racial discipleship. When it comes to our kids, white parents tend to have a very high value on innocence and wanting to shield our children from difficult things, and that would include, race, racism, white supremacy, and so on. And so we abdicate our responsibility here. Now, many parents of color, and I've learned this particularly from African American parents, have conversations with their children at very young ages about what it means to be Black in this country, to take one example, and to prepare that young person for the moments when they will experience racism, either very overtly or more subtly. And and my understanding here is that caregiver or that parent is doing a couple of things. One, on a very pragmatic level, they are preparing that child for this likely event to happen, and they don't want that child to be surprised. They don't want that child to be crushed. But in another way, that parent, that caregiver, is discipling their child in the truth. They're saying to that child, you're going to be lied to in this country. You're going to be lied to about your identity, about your value, about your worth. It's going to happen. And when that does, you need to remember the truth. This is who you are. This is the God in whose image that you have been formed. This is how deeply loved and valued you are. This is the hope and the future. I'm going to start preaching here, but you get the idea, right? So that when that happens, that child has been so saturated in the truth that lie is able to kind of bounce off and not infect their imagination. Now, white parents, because we don't see ourselves as facing the same reality, that same pragmatic reality, right? We don't see our white children as facing that. We don't have those conversations. But by not having those conversations, we are not discipling our children, because that white child is going to be lied to as well. And the same society that's lying to the Black child is lying to the white child as well about their identity, about their value, about their place on the racial hierarchy in this country. And so we are abandoning them to the racial discipleship of this country. And as they're trying to navigate at a very young age and make sense of this world, they're internalizing the lies that are attached to the observations that they're making about their place in the racial hierarchy. So this is where I think a local church could make a real difference. What would it look like for a congregation to begin equipping families and parents to have these conversations, to equip them with language and with biblical kind of metaphors and narratives to introduce their children to this? But again, Dominique, you've thought a lot about this.
Yeah, jump
and I know
in,
you've
Dominique.
done some work around this too.
Yeah. So I don't think most of our listeners fall into this bucket, but there's this strong thread of Christianity that resists and denies science and the empirical findings that come out of scientific research. But one of the findings that we know is that our implicit biases start to form and be shaped as young as 2, and neuroscientists have said that the cognitive associations that we make with race are sedimented in our minds and our brains by the age of 7. And so the racial associations that kids make by the age of 7 is really going to dictate their interaction with race, unless they have some kind of cataclysmic encounter where they are dislocated and are in a kind of semi-permanent way, at least, positioned as the outsider, the minority, the other. And so given that, and given the tendency that David mentioned, for white parents to want to protect the innocence of their children, white children are not equipped to engage in the world in a healthy cross-cultural way, to not see race as a threat, as something that is not part of their discipleship, part of their cultural competency, something that's a necessity to survive in the world, their ability to navigate the realities of race. Where BIPOC kids are pretty much across the board, it's becoming more and more true, across the board. Parents realize that for their children to make it to 18, they have to have these conversations with them well before they're mature enough to have them. Maturity is thrown out the window when you're thinking about how do you help them survive. And so really the conversation of innocence is a conversation of privilege. And really what what we have to realize as in the church is that until white parents realize that it's just as important and just as much of a necessity for them to talk to their kids about race before they're emotionally mature enough to fully comprehend it in the same way that BIPOC parents do, then we're going to continue to have this inequitable conversation.
Right.
And we have to realize that we have to enter into this together on an equitable playing field, which means having these conversations before these racial associations get sedimented in a way that leads to a distorted sense of self and a perverted way of engaging the world that's tainted by the powers and the principalities in the way they seduce
Mhm.
folks into embracing whiteness at the expense of the communion that God commissioned us to enjoy together equitably.
Mhm.
And so that's part of it. And one of the things that we've done, and David's probably also alluding to this, is within the covenant, we've created a discipleship resource that is specifically for children. And it starts to introduce them to these concepts in age appropriate ways. And it starts to give them the historical foundation of our country to understand why racism isn't something that you can just attend to in a one deep, thorough engagement, but it is this consistent reality that we're going to have to kind of engage with if we're going to figure out how to faithfully follow Jesus in a racially divided nation.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that
And
there's a curriculum for kids. I love hearing about that.
yeah.
What
It's
are some
called
other
Justice
things?
Journey for Kids, just
Justice
for and
Journey for
just
Kids.
yep, and we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. What are some other things like rubber meets the road that local churches are doing that are trying to move from superficial diversity to true solidarity? What are some other
Mhm.
things like
Mhm.
that kids curriculum?
Yeah, this is something I'm really always super interested to hear, from local churches and local pastors, because really they're the ones who are on the front lines of this conversation. This was a big aha for me probably about 5 or 6 years ago, where after about 5 years of pastoring a multiracial church, I realized that there was this entire group of churches and clergy who actually were pretty committed personally to reconciliation and justice, but who saw no role for themselves in it because their
Mm.
settings were not diverse, at least from their own vantage point. And that's part of what I'm hoping to do in this book, is to say, actually, this is for all of us. It really doesn't matter,
Mhm.
what your demographics are like. We need everybody involved here. So I've loved hearing stories about. I'll say this: the instinct in white churches is to think, well, I need to immediately pursue diversity. Either I need to try to make my church more racially diverse, or I need to start like get out into the community and start doing these partnerships with churches who are different than mine. And those are not bad things. But what I have in mind is more the daily, the weekly kind of rhythms of a congregation, the liturgical stuff.
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot of potential around, for example, Holy Communion or the Eucharist. Here is the moment where we recognize our reunion with God, but there is this other layer of the fellowship, which is that we are reunited with one another as well. There's a theologian, Teresa Latini, who describes this as the twofold vocation of the church, of
Mm.
fellowship with God and fellowship with one another. And that is we hold that together at the table. But most white Christians in our kind of Western individualism have really only emphasized that first note of our fellowship with God at the cross. So there's all of this latent potential at the table, just to begin including in some of our liturgical language, or maybe the sermon before that, or the prayers that precede that, to begin forming people to remember that we are the people of God together. And though perhaps our
Mhm.
congregation is majority white, we belong to a much more diverse body whose lived experiences matter to us,
Mhm.
who, if they're rejoicing, we're going to rejoice. If they're mourning, we're going to mourn. So those are the
Mhm.
kinds of I don't want to say nudges, but those are the kinds of reimaginings that I think start to be really fruitful in a local congregation, and that might lead to things like shared service projects in the neighborhood, or doing something to serve the community, maybe some shared worship services, those kinds of things. But I want us to think a little bit closer to home first. I don't want us to think first about who are we going to serve, or who are we going to go outside with. I want us to kind of hold the mirror a little bit closer to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say one other kind of thing that I think, particularly for our kids, that could be helpful in that regard is, I think a lot of people, as David kind of articulated, think, well, we can't be involved because we don't have diversity. And once our geographic setting becomes more diverse, then we'll take up these conversations. And I always like to say, the truth is that there's work before the work. And there's work that you have to do so that when diversity shows up at your door, you're ready to faithfully respond to it and not actually work out all the mess you should have worked out before it got there, so that you can faithfully receive the diversity that is emerging. And I think for our kids, a very tangible way to do it would be to really look seriously at these cultural heritage months, Black History Month, Latin Heritage Month, and there are children's books that actually start to tell the history and the experience of our neighbors from a historic perspective that actually starts to give them insights into the culture and the history and the background that's going to be important for them as they try to become ambassadors of reconciliation in the world, and bridge builders and repairers of the breach. And so I think, it's an opportunity for us to, if nothing else, every year buy your kid on Ethnic Heritage Month a book that comes from an author from that ethnic background, and read
Yeah.
that book with them for the month. And you will build a catalog over the course of time, and your kids will actually start to have a pretty decent foundation of cultural competency as they start to enter into these conversations. And they'll start to connect the dots between the experience of Indigenous, Black, Asian American, Latin, and say, like,
Right.
oh, there is something different here. And as I go through school and I'm learning what I'm learning in school, all of these stories aren't represented in the curriculum that I'm being exposed to. So they'll start to see that there's some disconnects. And that's where we get a chance to really broker in and press in and do some discipleship work. And so that's just one very tangible invitation that I would offer up to folks.
If I could add a couple others there, because I think it's helpful to be able to picture this stuff. And so Dominique's idea of, even within our homes, how we can do this. But I would, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, our church was invited to participate in a protest related to kind of another instance of kind of racial trauma in the country. And so here in our neighborhood churches, after our services, we walked out and joined together in one of the main streets and kind of walked down the street together. And I shared this with some of the other churches in our denomination in the city. And there was a church up on the north side who said, yeah, we want to do this, but we're not going to come down to your majority Black neighborhood. We're actually going to do it in our majority white neighborhood. Now, I thought that was absolutely brilliant, because what they were doing is saying that, and this is very, very counterintuitive to most white people. They were saying that these issues related to injustice and systemic racism are ours. They are our responsibility. They exist in our churches and our communities. And so we don't need to go into in this case, a Black neighborhood to stand in solidarity. We actually need to take a prophetic stance in our own community to say, this is our conversation. These are our realities that we have to reckon with as well. And that's a big shift, actually, for a church to make, to say, when we're talking about race, we're not talking about something that's over there. When we're talking about racism, we're not talking about something that's over there. We're talking about something that's right here that we have to get our arms around. So a pastor that Dominique and I know who serves a church in a kind of rural small town here in Illinois, during the uprisings and protests last summer, there was, in his very, very white town, there was a very small group of people organizing a Black Lives Matter rally, and none of the other pastors in the in the town were going to participate. And this pastor said, I'm going to be there. Again, this is mostly white town, mostly white people participating. But for him, he realized it's important that I kind of model for my congregation that we are a part of this, that we have a role to play in this. And this is not just something over there in Chicago, right? Or in a more diverse church. This is a role that we have to play as well.
Yeah. Yeah. One other thing I just want to throw into the mix there, I love that we're talking really practical. This is what it actually looks like, right? Rashida Graham Washington, who does a lot of work in racial righteousness and justice in Chicago, came to LaSalle about 4 or 5 years ago. And one of the things she asked us to commit to was to diversifying just our reading habits, our shopping habits, our economic habits, and to, as individuals and then corporately as a church, that tilted us. It tilted our center of balance. I don't know if we have a vendor or a tradesperson that we utilize for our ministry centers or our ministries or our church, our congregation on Sunday, that is not owned and managed by a person of color. And that took us a bit. It took us a bit to move economically to say from just kind of, this guy's uncle or this person who's always been our HVAC guy or whatever it is, right? But moving into a space where economically, when we purchase services, we're doing it from a person of color. We think economic justice matters. And this is one smallish way we can practice it. Also, where we shop, it's been, that for me was a moment. I intentionally changed my shopping habits from the grocery store I go to if I'm in a space, the salesperson that I seek out is a small thing. It's a big thing. It's like a mustard seed, right?
Yeah.
So I just throw that out for people, that those are things that you don't really think about unless somebody tells you. And even then you think, well, that's a little patronizing or that's a little this or that. But I think it matters. I think it starts to shift.
I agree so much. And I realize that what you said from one vantage point could sound like, oh, that's such a little thing, Laura. That's not like, you're not really moving the needle. And okay, but let's set that aside for just a second. And let's acknowledge the kind of segregated nature of the typical white imagination. Not that we have consciously opted into that, but the air that we have breathed has segregated our imaginations. It's segregated us to see what's possible and what's not possible, what's likely and what's unlikely. And the really good thing about what you just said, in my opinion, is that we can actually change that is not inevitable. That's something as simple as the books that I'm going to choose to read, or the media I'm going to choose to spend time with, the service providers. Am I going to be intentional about who my doctor is, who my dentist is? Like that stuff over time. This is not virtue signaling. These are not boxes that we're checking. We are allowing our imaginations to be sanctified, to be reformed in a way that new possibilities start to open up in front of us, things that we wouldn't have even considered before. So now that pastor who's done what you described, when there is that moment of public racial trauma, when she's preparing for her sermon that Sunday, there are all kinds of new voices in that pastor's heads, right? There's all kinds of new lenses that they're interpreting the scripture through. There's a whole different community that's being brought into the pulpit with that person in a way that doesn't even feel intentional anymore, because it's simply a part of this person's network about how they're doing life, right? With other members of the body of Christ. And so I hope that we don't downplay that. And I also hope that your example reminds us that we do have agency here. This conversation about systemic racism, it can start to feel real overwhelming to people. It can feel like, can I do anything here? And the answer is yes, you absolutely can do something, and it might feel like mustard seeds, but I can testify in my own life and the life of friends how over time that those kinds of decisions make a really significant difference. And if you're a person then with influence with other people, you start influencing them in similar kinds of ways.
So Laura, I want to jump in real quick and ask David. So you're somebody who, me and you have done it together, but you're somebody who's done a lot of work on race and geography, or race and place. Can you talk about the significance of that? And then I'm going to dovetail and ask you to talk about how that plays out in your call as a white pastor in a historically significant Black community.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this a lot, and I'm still learning. They're still kind of growing in my own understanding and awareness of the significance of place, of geography, of land, of creation itself. I think this is often the voice that we're not listening to too closely enough. And so for me, over the past few years, reading lots of Indigenous authors and having conversations with Indigenous friends, because I think that this is where I have a lot of learning and growing to do. But yes, one of the things that race does, and one of the things that race was intended to do, is to kind of sever us from place, so that the kind of redemptive formational power of place gets severed, so that we can be placed on a racial hierarchy of our own making. So the thing that becomes most important about me is where I fit on that hierarchy, rather than how the place, the land, the stuff of geography has actually formed me. And so, yeah, I think that one of the, and here I'm continuing to learn from people like Willie Jennings and others, one of the great and sort of beautiful things that compels us forward in this is, how is it that the creation is still latent with formational potential? And what would it look like for a people to get together, commit themselves to be cared for by place, even as we care for that place, this kind of relationship of mutuality with the creation itself. I believe that the creation still has that formational potential. It takes a kind of radical commitment to step off of the conveyor belt of things like consumer capitalism and the pursuit of the American dream. Everything about our society orients us away from this. And so it's still very much an open-ended question of whether it's actually possible for people to do this. There's not tons of examples. We catch glimpses of it in our history, I think. But that, to me, is the beautiful vision that captures my own heart, that a people together can still be formed by this good creation. So in terms of Bronzeville, I can just say I have been formed over these 10 plus years in this neighborhood, and that for me has come in large part through people who have been in this community for a very, very long time, who have been cared for this community and care for this community, the way that I imagine myself and my own role, the way that I can testify to the Holy Spirit's faithfulness to a place, even though I wasn't here, that I've been invited into the narratives of those who've been here for generations. Really important people to me, who I'll never meet. People like Ida B. Wells, who lived in this community, and whose legacy and discipleship and kind of commitment have profoundly formed, my understanding of faithful Christian ministry. But all of this is rooted in a particular place. And so I think a lot about I'm not a wine person, but there's this, I think it's called terroir. So if you guys are wine people, but it's the idea that you can kind of taste the soil that the grape grew from, right? It should have a distinctiveness to it. That, I think, is what the church ought to be, that we are so deeply rooted in a place that if you walked in and kind of closed your eyes and just listened, you would be able to pick up on where you were, because of the heart for the place that the people exhibit, but also how that place has formed those people. And I think it's in that particularity that we can then exhibit a real beautiful hospitality to those whose particularities are different than our own. The kind of tendency in evangelicalism and in whiteness this in general is we need to flatten out all those particularities. We need to flatten everything out to whiteness, and then you assimilate to that, and we can be together. And I think the biblical vision is radically different than that, and way better, way more beautiful.
That's great.
What a beautiful image, huh? Right?
David, I was wondering if you could give us one last word for churches and pastors and communities that are early on in this work or just starting into this work or have been doing it for a while. It can get difficult. You run into roadblocks. And unfortunately, maybe I'm a cynic, but it seems like churches are only as quote unquote progressive as the biggest donor in the church. Because as soon as things get too uncomfortable and someone starts to think about pulling their funding, these are real conversations that churches have to have. I wonder if you could give pastors or communities just a word of encouragement when they hit these roadblocks. Why is this worth the headaches and the work?
Yeah, this is one of the sort of more discouraging but also hopeful things to me about the past year is that there are pastors who have been fired because of this. And I mean, what a terrible thing, but also, man, what an inspiring thing to know that there is a remnant who understand how significant this is. And I'm certainly inspired by that. I think for me, it's just knowing how good it is. And it's knowing that the deeper that you get into this ministry and this work, the more impossible it is to ever turn back. Because do I want to go back to my more segregated life? Do I want to go back to, more of a homogenous experience? And the answer, of course, is no. And do I want to go back to being less involved in works of justice and getting to see the Spirit do miraculous things through people's very ordinary service and sacrifice? Like, of course not. Like that's a horrible way to live after you've experienced this, right? And so I do think this is one of my Christian convictions is that we attempt to sacrifice for God, but any attempt to sacrifice is met with an experience of generosity and gift because God is simply goodness itself. And so I guess that'd be my word of encouragement is that there comes a point in this ministry and this work where you realize that turning around is just not an option anymore, not because you've become so righteous yourself, but because the alternative is just much more terrible than the good work that you're a part of, And so I think from the outside, people can like, oh man, you're doing this must be difficult or pushback, and yes, that's a part of it. And Dominique knows this way better than I do, but we taste and see that the Lord is good, and when you taste and see, you don't want to trade it for anything else.
That's great.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Well, any final words from anybody before we wrap up?
Go ahead, Dominique. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, David, can you send us off with one, a couple lines? One of the things I really appreciate about you is your awareness of the intention, how intentional you have to be, and the wisdom you can glean when you submit to Black women's leadership.
Yeah, I thought we were wrapping it up, but then you put like this massive, way that I've been formed over my life. So yeah, let me tell you really brief. I just wouldn't be who I am without, very specific Black women who have led me, who have graciously, spent time with me over the years. I remember early on my spiritual director, who's been my director, for probably 13 or so years now, I was kind of describing to her that how as a white man in our neighborhood and our church, all of my instincts didn't feel helpful any longer. And how I was trying to navigate this world from a place of perceived kind of weakness or foolishness. And she just looked at me and she said, well, that's great, David. You're starting to get a tiny little taste of what I navigate, most days. And there's so many times over the years where Black women like that have, again, graciously and they didn't have to do this, shared those kinds of perspectives with me. And so whether they're people, saints who've passed on for a while, like Ida B. Wells, or spiritual directors and mentors and pastors and friends. I couldn't say really enough about how how significantly I've been formed in that way. And I say that carefully because I don't want people running out and like knocking on, random Black women's doors, right? I'm trusting that people aren't going to do that, but also that thankfully there's amazing books that are available to us now and amazing teachings. And so there's ways to be formed by some of these faithful leaders. But I will say that this is one of the gifts of multiracial community as well, is the kind of organic nature that some of these friendships can develop that can really change the trajectory of a person's life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your work, your book. The book is called Rediscipling the White Church, From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity. I just found this whole conversation really encouraging and helpful. I'm excited to look into that kids curriculum that we'll link in the show notes. But just thank you so much for your work and for being with us. We'll be back in a couple weeks on this show talking about faith and the common good. But until then, we'll see you around. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you.